next presenter is Hatim Rahman. Hatim is an assistant professor of management and organizations here at the Kellogg School of Management. And the title of his presentation is called Control in the Age of Algorithms, Exploring the Cold Start Problem and Reputational Interdependence on Online Labor Markets. So a round of applause for... I think he'll help you.
Well, while it's getting started, thank you again to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Really looking forward to sharing some of this and getting your feedback. So the title of the talk was presented. Before I go into the specific one, I thought I'd situate my work. There are familiar faces, but also new ones that aren't as familiar with what I've been doing. So broadly speaking, I think of my work as trying to theorize how the nature of control is changing with algorithms, specifically from a worker's context in the online labor markets. And so this talk today is kind of building off of and extending some of my recent work, my own and with some amazing collaborators, some of who are here today, that's looking again at how the nature of control is changing with algorithms, how we should be conceptualizing it, both at kind of more the macro level and the dyadic level between organizations and workers who are using this market. And so today's talk is coming from a book that I have under contract with the University of California Press, where I'm going to present some of the arguments I make about workers' ability to kind of get started when they don't have networks in these online labor markets, and then what kind of happens with their networks outside of these online labor markets once they gain experience. And so just to contextualize this, I don't think this audience needs much motivation for this talk, but some areas that I wanted to highlight is that it's not necessarily a surprise that lots of organizations are using algorithms to influence how they hire workers. And so in this case, 99% of Fortune 500 companies report using algorithms with hiring. And of course, there are consequences to this, right? We've already talked about it, so I won't elaborate on this over here. But when you have biased data, it can lead to biased outcomes. The interesting thing to, connecting to networks here is that the women who are discriminated against, think about the inability for them to start certain networks, right? That they are excluded from when they're undergoing these biased outcomes. And a lot of times they don't necessarily have any insight that they were discriminated against. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, I pulled this in January, you see that it's not just on the hiring side where workers are impacted, but also on the firing side, algorithms are also being used. And this, as we talked about, this can be used in ways that help make the process less biased and more efficient, but there are also very legitimate concerns that we discuss where if it's not done in the proper way, it can lead to more biased outcomes. So what I'm going to focus on, the hiring and firing is kind of the bookends of the labor market process. I'm going to focus more on, as I mentioned, kind of in between, like what happens when organizations' algorithms are used at the beginning when workers join an online labor market, and then also as they gain experiences. And so the current theory that I'm going to build off of generally talks about how the use of algorithms is a double-edged sword for workers. It provides more visibility for people, but it also decreases their control. So I'm going to extend this work by, with some of the data I've collected qualitatively with participant observation, interviews, and discussion board data from one of the largest high-skilled online labor markets, which I'll introduce in a little bit, called Talent Finder. And so the main finding that I'll elaborate on later in the presentation is that for new workers, they encounter the cold start problem, which many of you are familiar with, but I'll elaborate on it. Essentially, when you join for the first time, the algorithm doesn't have information about you, your network, or necessarily your skills, and so it struggles to be able to match new workers without that type of information. So I'm going to show you some of the consequences that has for these new workers. And then there's this, I'm looking forward to hear your feedback. Once you establish yourself in these online labor markets, the visibility and permanence of your reputation begins to spread, not only within the online labor market, but also between labor markets. So what I'll show you with some of the data that's here is that once, if I get a rating on this market, all of a sudden when people are searching for me on LinkedIn or Google and so on and so forth, they can also now see my ratings and my reputation on these platforms. In some instances, this is good, right? If I want to be discovered more broadly. In other instances, it can be problematic if you don't necessarily like your rating or reputation that you form on that market. And so I'll come back to this at the end, is that some of the previous mechanisms of navigating, starting your networks and labor markets are less effective when algorithms increase both the visibility and permanence of a worker's reputation. Okay, so very briefly, we know from a lot of historical literature that in conventional labor markets, so maybe before pre-algorithms, that workers have a lot of agency in how they present themselves. It wasn't that long ago when I was on the job market, and some audiences I was an information scholar, others I was an organization scholar, right? I had some agency in how I tailored my research and how I presented myself to different schools, right? And even with some existing work that looks more closely at contract workers, that there's this ability for them to kind of stretch their experiences, right? So you might not have the skill set to get a certain job, but in order to gain it, you need experience. If you don't have that experience, you're able to maybe stretch your credentials in ways that show you have this competence, so that you're able to secure a job. So one thing that I think is common about prior literature is that most workers' reputation is built within an organization or a community and is not as readily quantified and publicly accessible. I kind of joke, like you're not generally able to find out what my high school grades are, or what I was known for in high school, although that's changing for this generation. But you don't necessarily know the things that I went through in ways that are very different in people's experiences today. So kind of what's new with algorithms? We were talking about it in our previous presentation too. So some scholars have begun to talk about how the way algorithms are instantiated in online labor markets in the way they're used right now is that compared to other forms of technology, they tend to be more opaque, especially for people who are subject to them, right? So I don't necessarily know why I show up in a certain area of the search results when you're subject to those algorithms. They tend to be more instantaneous, interactive, and encompassing. There's overlap in some of these terms, but the idea here is that they operate at a much greater scale and speed than previous technologies. And then they enhance commensuration, right? You're generally reduced to certain ratings and quantified in ways that don't encapsulate the complexity of your reputation or who you are, but nonetheless, it's being reduced to certain outcomes that are being used by algorithms. So again, that was just a very brief overview of going back to this question, particularly as I mentioned from a worker's perspective, is how is the use of algorithms impacting their ability to form and navigate networks within and between labor markets. Okay, so this context that I'm going to have is high-skilled online labor market. So unlike Amazon Mechanical Turk, where it's more, a lot of people are familiar with rote tasks, this is more like Upwork, Fiverr, where you can hire software engineers, graphic designers, literally almost any expert. And you can see over here in the tagline, right? Real pros, real fast. The idea here is that hiring is generally a very costly, timely process. And with the use of their algorithms, they can kind of help organizations and clients find people much more quickly than searching their own network manually. So just if you were to search this platform, the interesting thing about it is that a lot of these are modeled after kind of Google and their search results, where you have the worker, their rating in about one and a half sentences about them. You can go on and click more about them, but you will see a list of workers all presented with the same amount of information there. So just put some context on this, right? I mean, a lot of these online labor markets are growing, especially in the pandemic when more people turn to remote work. So yeah, this is a completely remote setup where you can hire someone from anywhere around the world, but you work distributed. So you can see some of the numbers out there. It's a very large and growing area. As mentioned here, 30% of Fortune 100 companies have used Talent Finder to hire people for their projects and teams. So I mentioned this, I alluded to it earlier. I'm happy to go into more detail during the Q&A, but yeah, for many years, I kind of approached this ethnographically. I'll talk about it in the next slide a little bit too. I mean, by collecting such rich data, it did lead itself to also some natural language processing, which I'll mention over here. So as I mentioned, I primarily use a qualitative inductive analysis to analyze this data. Supplemented it with natural language processing, which again, I'm happy to talk about more, and just try to iterating between the data to identify insights that advance both theory and practice. Okay, so I want to spend the bulk of the time in the findings, so to get your thoughts and feedback here. So for those who are not familiar, the cold start problem refers to the fact that an algorithm is unable to recommend or match a new worker because the worker has no prior rating or information which the algorithm can use to base this recommendation. So if you are a new worker to sign up for Upwork or Fiverr, so on and so forth, you're likely to encounter experience that this person, who I'm calling Robert, mentioned in an interview when he joined the online labor market platform. And by he's a software engineer, so he says, first I had to create a reputation, and it's really hard because when you're on Talent Finder, nobody knows you, so they don't know what you do, who you are, what's your experience level, if you're a professional or whatever, you know? And again, given that this is a global labor market, it's hard, the algorithm doesn't necessarily trust what you input, right? So if you sign up and you're a world-class machine learning engineer, they don't put as much weight into what you self-report. They want to see actual kind of data that's commensurate where they can compare it and then recommend you from that information. And so one outcome of this is that workers report trying to set lower wages to be more competitive on the labor market, right? In hopes that they can get some data for the algorithm there. So I know this worker mentioned that I know I had to do some projects for a lot lower rates than what I was hoping to get, but you kind of have to do that to build visibility and get good reviews so that you can get more projects in the future. When I first started out, I was only charging around $10 an hour. Now I'm charging $35 an hour for my time. So this is actually, to me, this is less surprising too, right? A lot of times when you start out in a new field, there's some grad students here, like, you know, when I was starting a grad school, I would work for free for a new project, right? So it's not necessarily surprising. What is different though, is that because again of the visibility of these platforms, is that the wage that you set initially, it persists. So a different freelancer worker said that it took me about 3 years, at least 3 years, before I finally got to where I could actually charge what I should be charging. Although even now I should be charging a lot more. So the point here is that the first wage you set, the algorithm begins to pick up on what you did and starts to categorize and recommend and kind of peg you to that being your wage that you start with. And not only that, people on the platform, organizations and clients, they also see like, oh, you charged, you know, somebody just like $10 to do this project. You know, you should be offering me a similar wage as you offer someone else. And again, these are very high-skilled people who they mentioned like it can take them years to be able to recover from that initial wage that they set. Unsurprisingly, it puts a lot of pressure on your first job, right? As this freelancer very succinctly said, if you don't do it well, you're almost dead, right? Because if the algorithm picks up or other organizations or clients see that you have a lower rating, given the millions of other workers on the platform, it's very hard to recover from a difficult start, which again adds pressure even more so when you're beginning to start out. The other thing that I want to mention that begins to filter is that one outcome of the cold start problem, it can lead to client exploitation. So one worker talked about, this is a software engineer who had decades of experience before joining the platform, right? But he was at a point where he was laid off, and so he was looking for another opportunity. He said, you know, to try to overcome the cold start problem, you know, I applied for everything, hundreds and hundreds of jobs a month. But there were some cases where I got some projects that turned into some horrible jobs for me, that ended up working. So he goes on to explain that essentially the client, because he knows that this is one of their first jobs, he begins to ask for more revisions without offering more pay. And he knows that the person who hired him, he knows that because the first rating and the first wages are so important, they're able to ask for more without the worker being able to push back and ask for compensation for their additional work. The other thing that I want to highlight, this kind of leads to suboptimal outcomes for multiple people, is that the inability to get started and really kind of form your network of skills and experience can lead to discouraging participation for very high-skilled people who can contribute, right? So this worker mentioned that I opened an account in 2013. At that time, I tried again and again, but I didn't get any job. I tried for 3 or 4 months because I thought I could get a job, but no one hired me because I didn't have any experience. So last year, so now 4 years later, one of my friends encouraged me and I tried again. So it's 4 years that clients and this worker are kind of not being able to match and take advantage of their skill set. So another thing that kind of came out through my analysis is this kind of market inefficiency. To some extent, I'll explain this in a second, it reveals the worker's creativity, but it does lead to inefficiency. So one worker, to try to overcome the cold start problem, he said, I decided to create a fake profile on the platform, and then I posted a job for programmers for other people to bid. So I got around 70 to 80 proposals. So what I did is I went through all of them. I just read all of them in detail. Then I got an idea here of how people are bidding and what attracts the job posters, right, to get a sense. So it's smart for the worker, but the reason I'm saying it leads to inefficiency is that people spend time applying for a fake job, right? That takes time, that takes effort, that's uncompensated for them. And then for the worker themselves, right, like going through that, it's not necessarily the best use of time for them either in the long term. So just to summarize this one, and then I'll get to the last theme, is that in the beginning, platform algorithms struggle to match new workers to the platform who don't have any prior ratings or established networks that the algorithm can ascertain. So new workers, even though they have tons of experience, but they're new to the algorithm, they set lower wages to take any work and get the first job in rating. But the consequences for this is that low wages can persist. There's a chance for increased worker exploitation and market inefficiencies. And in the discussion, I'm going to get to this, but one potential kind of thought of how to address this is actually less visibility and less permanence. So I'm going to get to that in a second, but if you can allow a new worker to take some jobs that allow them to establish themselves before you start to post what wage that they kind of negotiated and what job they took, it might allow for a better middle ground there. Okay. So the next thing the last thing I want to talk about that came out of my analysis of this data is something that I'm calling reputational interdependence. And so the way that I'm defining this is that that platforms or these online markets algorithms, they enhance both the visibility and permanence of a worker's reputation between labor markets, but in a way that's beyond a worker's control. So again, the data will illustrate this concept. So one worker talked about how once they began to establish themselves on Talent Finder, they began to find out that all their other online kind of presence, like LinkedIn, they begin to also see increased traffic. So many times what happens is when I'm talking to a client, I notice that my LinkedIn profile gets hits and I have a day job profile. So my day job profile as well as my personal webpage, I'll get hits, and so on and so forth. So it's not just managing your presence on Talent Finder, you have to manage your overall web presence, right? So they begin to become interconnected in ways that, in this case, is beneficial, right? You get more client output, you get people discovering you in ways that were previously difficult. But in other cases, as this worker mentioned, that I changed my visibility to Talent Finder users only, though the setting now has been changed to only people on the platform, my profile still appears in Google search. I want to remove my profile from Google search, and this person's asking on the discussion boards, how can I do that? Please help, right? As I mentioned, a lot of times when people start on online labor markets or on these platforms, they're just doing a curiosity. So they might not pay much attention to what they're putting on, but that has consequences as this information is shared between these different online markets. So in response to this worker's question, the platform responded saying, like, we don't have control of the results. You can check Google Help Center pages about removing information from their searches. If anyone's tried that, you'll be in for a rabbit hole, right? So the interesting thing over here, though, is that some workers reported that, I was not active on the platform because they began to get work offline. But then I see that they're setting like Talent Finder was taking it on its own to set their profile to private. They said you'll still be able to find clients, but people outside the Talent Finder won't be able to find you. They won't be able to look for you. This is just to emphasize again that organizations, they do have a lot of power and say on whether or not people's information is shared more broadly, right? So I'll return to this theme in a slide or two here. So, experienced workers' ratings on a platform are accessible and increasingly being connected on other platforms or organizations. One thing that I kind of highlight in the book is that a lot of people ask, why can't workers just leave, right? They don't need to ask the platform for any permission, but I kind of introduced this as a mechanism for why workers continue to stay active on platforms, even though they don't need to, right? So I had present more data in the book about people talking about they don't need to find more work on the platform, but because this information is interconnected and shared in ways that they can't control, right? That's the main thing. Like, they can't necessarily control how Talent Finder shares it with Google and then how Google shares it with LinkedIn, so on and so forth. They feel compelled to continue to stay active on the platform. That's beneficial potentially for the platform, but less so for workers in this instance. Okay, so just to kind of to sum up, and then we'll go to the Q&A, is that I think organizations' use on algorithms changes the nature of control and workers' experiences within and between labor market networks, because as I mentioned, workers have less control over how they present themselves, especially once the algorithm kind of takes hold and forms that narrative. So this is particularly highlighted in the cold start problem, right? The initial wage that you set, the initial experience, how you list yourself, has huge ramifications of how the algorithm interprets you and your subsequent success on the market. So again, I think this idea of reputational interdependence kind of focuses on how algorithms enhance both the visibility and permanence of workers' reputation, but again, workers have little to no control. And so some implications that I'll mention is that some of the mechanisms or practices that people use in the past are less effective, because I think that in some sense the use of algorithms kind of boxes you in, right? It's harder to restart or to remake yourself in ways, or even extend to something adjacent, if the algorithm pegs you as a qualitative researcher or a software engineer. If you want to try to make that jump, it'll be interesting. I don't know, I should talk to Brian more about this. Brian started out as an ethnographer, and imagine if an algorithm just pegged you into that, it might make it a little more difficult to make that transition, right? As it relates to the cold start problem, something maybe a little counterintuitive is that I think less visibility would help, right? So if instead of taking your first one or two wages that you set, which you kind of have to do to gain traction, if the platform or the organization allows you to, after maybe like 5 jobs, show your average across those jobs, or your most recent jobs wages, and not the initial ones that you use to kind of stand out. So one thing that I wanted to highlight, it came up a little bit in our discussion today, and I think it's a point that Brian and others make as well, is that there's nothing really inherently problematic about technology or algorithms or AI, right? To me, what I try to highlight in the book and some across my work is that our focus on how organizations, institutions, regulation are using them for control requires continued attention, right? Algorithms, AI, so on and so forth, they reflect organizational values. They reflect our priorities and what we do with them. Okay, so I will leave it there.
So, the last slide again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, of course, it's not the algorithm, but there is a question. There is a problem with the platform. And if you think about the platform, is structured to favor the employers and to disfavor the employees.
That's right.
The employees have no control over transparencies. The employer has perfect control over transparency. For example, the platform shows my salary history as a worker, but I have no idea what the employer is offering for this kind of jobs.
Yes.
So there is a structural problem here. It's not the algorithm.
Correct.
It's the way the platform deploys the algorithm.
But yes, exactly. This is to this point. And again, workers are very attuned to the fact that they favor the people. And one of the kind of difficulties on these settings too is that generally, if you're a client or you're a worker, like you generally, the way they're structured, you have no insight into how these things work. All you want to do is find somebody quick for your project, right? So you don't pay attention. And structurally, that's kind of set up that way, right? Like clients are not generally held accountable for their exploitation or for how they do. So yes, 100% agree that it's
even Uber sounds better because both driver and drivees are rated.
That's right. That's right.
And here it's completely one-sided.
That's right. Yeah.
I have sort of a similar question. I really enjoyed your presentation on it. So you seem to conflate visibility and algorithm in your talk, right? In the sense that the algorithm makes something visible. But I think on this platform, if I'm familiar with platforms like this and others, right? There's an algorithm that's an underlying rating mechanism. But then the developers of the platform choose which aspects of that algorithm they want to make visible, right? So it's not just that every piece of the algorithm becomes visible, and they're not all visible in the same ways. And there are other kinds of platforms different than this one that will make additional information beyond what the algorithm is that's rating or matching people visible.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you just sort of disentangled those two things, right? You said, okay, there's algorithm here, and then there's parts of that, the algorithmic output that you could make visible.
Yeah.
How does that change the way that you think about it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, so you're right that, and it goes to the last point, is that like there are some elements that, and we see that over in some of the data too, right? They can decide not to make it visible. So yeah, I think it reinforces again like how important it is to understand like what our organization's priorities and values, and what they make visible or opaque does reflect what they value and who they're catering to. I don't know if you're looking for something more specific, but I will just say on the algorithm side is that because the infrastructure of these other search engines are using algorithms, once an organization does decide to make it visible, it kind of supercharges the whole system, right? Like the speed in which it spreads and becomes permanent is amplified with the use of algorithms. Yeah.
Well, I think the flip side of that is the kind of opacity that emerges based on what you make visible. So, I mean, it's interesting, this relational interdependence part that you talk about. So I could see somebody on the platform and then go look them up on LinkedIn and see a whole entire set of experiences that they've had that are not reflected on the platform.
Yes.
But the fact that the information on the platform gets propagated much farther than what you see on LinkedIn implicitly devalues a lot of that information that I might see on LinkedIn about somebody, right? And so it's the fact that you've made certain aspects of their behavior so visible that other aspects of their behavior become much more opaque.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing to add on to that is that, like, if that information becomes outdated, right? Like right now, we don't have systems in place for you to update that in way. You know, again, like go search to Google search, right? And like, good luck with that, right? So yeah, that's another thing where, again, if everything's aligned, it works great, it works well. But when you have these things, and again, for people who have, like, I mean, again, going back to earlier example, right? Like a lot of people in the labor market who take stops for childcare, disability, other things like that, right? When they come back on, they want to be able to update in ways that I think become more difficult. Yeah. Liz?
This is great. Thank you. I'm really interested around around your idea of visibility and how it's changed or not changed over time. We're working on some interesting work right now that's looking at informal networks outside of this. So how is it that people are exchanging information about pay rates, strategies for getting jobs, etc. And we're finding that the networks that people relied on pre-algorithm are pretty similar. So the men are hanging out at the golf club, sharing rates, but you know,
Yeah.
they're sharing rates, and we're finding the gender the women don't have the existing networks to even get that information to understand how to work the system. So my question was the quote of the person who said, I put 70, I asked for 70 jobs. My question is, where did that person, get that idea?
Yeah, so you are right. I mean, I don't have enough data to tease that out, but it is someone who is more experienced with the use. It was a male for that one
And
on this. What was that?
What age?
Youngerish,
Yeah.
but international, like from I was Bangladesh or India, right? So, and there's this international component too, right? Like going back to the earlier point about structural components, whereas like people who work who are like immigrants, others, they feel like they have to do these types of tactics that in order to stand out from like their other counterparts. But you are right. I mean, so this actually comes up in interesting. I kind of bring this on the book for like retirees, like people who are older and who are retired. Like ones who are able to like hire consultants to help them like transition have easier ability to transition onto these platforms, whereas others, they'll struggle. So, and it's a theme that I think that came up in Mary Beth's presentation as well. Like, yes, a lot of the stuff that happens offline is just becoming encoded online.
But it's encoded on, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not new in some ways. It's
Right.
the same networks
Yeah.
sharing information they've
Yeah.
always shared.
Yeah, that's right.
Morlan had a question.
Thanks for sharing all this. I'm curious to build on your point about like the international community. What could you imagine could be some ways that people negotiate like cultural tensions with the like expected norms with like the platform and the algorithm? So I could imagine that in some ways people could be viewing this as, a script of like how to like level up or like how to keep income during like transitional periods, but it's not obvious to me, like even in disciplines where you were using examples like software engineering or maybe like graphic design, how those industries, like their expectations around like freelance work or consulting may be influencing people's willingness to disclose or, link different platforms. So I'm just curious, how do you view like that kind of like, maybe like industry level like tension that could be existing based on the types of tasks available?
Yeah, I mean, I there's definitely a hierarchy on the website, right? Whereas like with more in-demand skills, are given preferential treatment in the search results and in the matching, and people become aware to this too. And in fact, now I mean, because they're so popular, they've changed the people's ability to join the platform as well. One of my colleagues, a professor at another school, he tried joining just for research purposes, and they rejected his application, right? Yeah, and one of the ways this plays out internationally, though, is interesting, is that workers actually try to team up together more. So if one person can't do it, like maybe if we start as a team, like we can be available around the clock, right? You start one profile, but 3 people actually manage it. Wow. So that they can be more responsive. It definitely plays out in interesting ways. I haven't written about it as much, but it's something that I did encounter in the data as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is out of scope, but I'm very curious. This is super interesting, how this affects the role of headhunting in the labor matching process.
A little louder.
Talk a little louder. How this affects like the headhunting, like traditional headhunting roles in the labor matching process. Like one of the questions I wanted to ask the previous presentation was how Cleverloan like affects the practice of top performers in the officers. Like did their default rates actually decrease because they were already so good? They didn't actually need algorithms to help them. And so similarly, like numbers of applications is never a problem for top organizations.
Yeah.
and so they often rely on headhunters to match like top performance and like say, students starting out from college, which is a culture problem, right? So like yeah, I was just interested on your thoughts, like full start reliance on like human in the loop scale across like competitiveness and like pay scale.
Did you want to answer on the one up?
I don't know.
Oh no, that was just like an exposition. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. So the interesting thing is that for headhunters, I mean, at the top, you're right. To some extent, they're insulated from this. But for some people, like online labor markets presents a way to kind of cut out the headhunter, right? And so you do see that something in the book. I talk about how some like organizations like Microsoft and others, like instead of having to rely on headhunters to bring people on board, they can go onto these platforms and get people on there. So in some ways, I think for top talent who didn't have access to those, because headhunters is very relational, very like kind of network based. And for people who don't have access to those ones, it gives them a new opportunity. So in some ways, it does threaten headhunters because it cuts them out in other ways. But they're not gone by any ways, right? Like the traditional players that rely on them still are very strong and get their.
They probably operate a different part of the skill spectrum, I would think.
That's right. And actually, to your point. The platform I studied, they actually try to go back to manually vetting workers as a premium service, right? So given the fact that algorithms, they're subject to gaming and other things like that, for premium organizations, they're like, we will manually vet and like kind of give you our increased access to information to be able to match you. To some extent, it kind of matches what you're saying.
Not necessarily headhunters, not labor. It's like also referrals as well. Like, what situations is the human element more important with it, like using in terms of using these platforms?
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you.
That's right.
That question made me think about inside of the organization, because these are organizations putting out proposals and looking for, instead of hiring people, they're outsourcing it, right?
Yeah.
So within the organization, so it's interesting, just the shifting that's going on, because within the organization, you've got somebody who's got to sort through all this, who's trying to figure out who to hire.
Yeah.
So then the platform turns around and provides that as a premium.
Yeah, and there's some interesting work too about like within organizations, like how you bring on board somebody from that, like whose kind of contractor is out, like what type of information do you share with them? So yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
A quick follow up on Herbert's. How do you, or what have you seen with respect to like skill differentiation, where some skills are more rare than others? Are the workers or freelancers able to capitalize on that, or do they feel like relatively undervalued based on what the platform may or may not be, visualizing or something, or the visibility of it?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that comes across in some of my work is that because we and Moshe brought this up earlier, is because of there isn't any formal relationship between any of the players in here. When things are going well, people get a lot of inbound traffic, right? Workers who are high in demand and they get like amazing amount of opportunities at work. But given the nature of the platform, right, like that could change anytime without like forewarning or foresight. Because generally speaking, even now, even though like domestically, I guess the labor market's tighter, but this is a setting in which it's a global labor market, and generally speaking, there's way more workers than there are projects. And so even if you're on the top, there's always this like kind of nagging uncertainty, like someone can replace you, or the algorithm can update, and it promotes somebody who's like a cheaper version of me that's at scale.
Thank you again for your presentation. I'm curious about the differences between what you found here compared to the offline, or what we knew like before, and I think it's kind of very similar. So like at least it's still very hard without in the offline world just to be hired. Like if you don't have the credentials, the connections. So what are I'm curious, like if you have found like the particular differences between what the algorithms do compared to previously, like that.
Yeah, and I will say like so this is high skilled, right? Like high skilled workers, people have experience, other things like that. Generally in high skilled labor markets, your institution, your advisors network, all those things, you can leverage those in ways that help you, right? That you can't necessarily do on this global labor market where they, to some extent right now, like the algorithm hasn't figured out how to quantify that in ways that are fair to people across areas. So you are right that the types of problems are similar. The extent to which they are exasperated on these markets, I think, is different. So I think it's more a question of degree and scale rather than type.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is kind of maybe going off of where Marlon was going with his first question about cultural differences, like in this kind of global market. I'm curious about, and this may have been outside of the scope of what you were looking for, but inequalities that emerge in these spaces and types of job seekers who may be left behind, maybe based on cultural differences in terms of how they view this whole process of even finding jobs in the first place and what they're willing to do to game the algorithm and the system.
Yeah, I mean, and so in that quote earlier, right, like one person who started, I mean, that was actually a worker from Bangladesh who started in 2013. He's like, I couldn't get anything, so I waited 4 years, right? So yeah, I haven't been able to quantify it, but for sure, you do see these types of inequalities arise. Going back to some of our another colleague, Sadalina's work about English being the kind of the lingua franca, right? And on this platform, they do formalize that. They try to quantify your English language speaking skills. And somebody who's highly skilled but isn't able to communicate very well, those are types of people who struggle to get started and don't get as much recognition.
But is that an opportunity to team up certain people that have different skills that could contribute to a project? I mean, is there a business opportunity here for someone or some company to develop a way to make people, cold start people more visible, to link them up, to try to put together the most qualified group of people?
Maybe like Flash Team, right? So the short answer is yes, but going back to kind of Mary Beth's point, like it really depends on a lot of the complexities that are there, because so the platform itself is trying, like this is all these issues the platform cares a lot about as well, right? Like they are aware of it and they try lots of things to experiment in trying to address it. I mean, I don't know how successful they've been, but the short answer is that like the platform wants to be the one to figure it out because they're the ones who can gain from it most, and they can police and be very wary of anyone else who tries to come on top of it. And I'm also kind of going back to the question of inequality and other things like that. I'm wary of like kind of scam artists presenting themselves as like, I'll tell you how to jumpstart, like I'll tell you how to get into Stanford or Northwestern, right? Like just pay me money. So that you do see that dynamic also arising here as well.
I just went on Fiverr. And I found you can post for a job for linking, profile creation, and optimization.
Ah, nice.
So there are all of these services that would help you optimize your profile.
You'll have to tell us by
20 seconds.
You'll have to tell us by the end of the day how effective it is.
So I'm stuck in the same job.
Yeah. Okay. What is one more question?
Is there any occurrence where these workers deploy their own algorithms? Like you fight algorithms with algorithms themselves?
So the question was, in case you didn't hear it, do the workers themselves try to deploy their own algorithms? So I haven't seen that, but they do try to collect a lot of data, right? Yeah. By starting your own fake client profile or observing who's getting the most jobs. So they try to do it, but going back to Moshe's earlier point, the platform is very, and to Paul's point also, like they don't release all the information. And I kind of mentioned this in my book too. Like they also changed the visibility of their source code, right? Like because workers began to be like, oh, I can't see it on the platform, but let me like check out the source code. And initially they were able to find out some things about like how the algorithm was working, but they ended up making that opaque as well. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much for your questions.